always risky when you've had a run yesterday to have another one, and but this is quite different to yesterday, and thank you for allowing me to share some of the things that we've been doing at St Vincent's and some of the things that we think we might sensibly be doing with all of you. So I thought Sister Claire Nolan was going to be sitting up here with me, so she's clever enough to sit down there. But I'll refer to her in a moment. But first of all, let me also join in the acknowledgement of country of the Turrbal people and thank, even if she's not with us, Auntie Kathy. I thought that she gave us a beautiful welcome, a very generous welcome given the story of her own background and her mother and so on. So that's always a special way of starting any of these things. But I won't deviate too much from my text. Archbishops can get away with that. I'm not sure that I could, and I want to be fairly precise about what I want to say, so if you'll excuse me, I will actually have a go at reading this. But first of all, what a pleasure to share this session, even if not the podium, with the wonderful Sister Claire Nolan, and I have to say, we at Vinnie's were just incredibly excited about last night and that wonderfully warm response that you all gave to Claire. She is a remarkable part of health governance, but she's also a remarkable and inspiring person in our family and in the certainly in my journey. She is certainly one of the people who actually brought me to this topic, which is the future of our sector. And certainly while she was the congregational leader, she encouraged this journey, and she still is doing so. So I felt I had some adult supervision in my comments today. Now, some decades ago, I had my first day at a real job, and I was article clerk to a prominent liquor licensing lawyer. And I inherited for a year the desk outside his office. It was full of files on the layouts of bars and restaurants. And I was not sure that was what had called me to the law, when to my delight, I found a fascinating file in my bottom drawer on industrial property. And I thought that was much more in line with my newfound standing as an article clerk. So I shared my excitement with the desk's predecessor, who, horrified, told me that this was the case that should never be opened. My sole task was to hand it on untouched to my successor. And I'm happy to tell you I did that quite well. And I had discovered my first corporate gorilla on my first day, not in the room in this instance, but in my bottom drawer. Now, over subsequent years, I have noticed many such gorillas, normally sitting quietly, sometimes benign, sometimes quite menacing, but always asking for an answer to a tough question. And I believe many in this room will recognise that the topic of this address is our shared gorilla, waiting in the same spot where we inherited it, but perhaps, I think, beginning to look hungry. So I ask, is this the time to approach it? And how can we do so without the risk of being crushed? Now, these remarks detail the journey of St Vincent's Health Australia, asking those questions. But forgive me if I need to start with my own personal journey to put this into some context. 3 years ago at the Mary Aikenhead Conference, I shared my response to the challenge given, in fact, from Father David Ransom. So it's good to see he's still busy from the Archbishop's comments yesterday. A year earlier, that all of us in positions of responsibility in the various ministries had become, by those very positions, leaders of the church. In my remarks titled, "A Church Leader, Surely Not I, Lord," I admitted that I had happily and comfortably seen the church's leadership more in terms of structures and hierarchies, not in terms of Vatican II's definition of the church as the people of God. And I'd acknowledged that there were many good reasons to reject, or at least avoid, this leadership burden, and to stay in the apparently safe seats at the back of the hall, watching with a critical and perhaps even a cynical eye. But by then, I had come to the conclusion that David Ransom was right, and that my performance in this ministry had to be judged primarily in terms of this wider role, a concept well outside my comfort zone and experience. And I acknowledge those of you who have come to this insight years ago. There's an incredible depth of church leadership in this room. But you will know, as Father Ransom knew, that once you fully embrace this leadership, everything changes quite radically. In particular, I concluded that, and I quote, "We must master the art of humbly acknowledging our failures, continuing to debate robustly areas where change may be required, and defending the inspired work that we do and the truly amazing people, including our clergy and religious, who do it." You may say it's impossible to do all three things together, and I would say that none have any chance without the other two. And if we do not do much better at this, we will stumble out of our decades of introspection and find by then that no one else cares. And I stand by those remarks, which I made some 3 years ago. A year later, I responded to the challenge of St. Aloysius' headmaster, Mark Tannock, in the college's Campion lecture, who put to me that the call to church leadership required too great a leap for his young leaders. I expect that this address is remembered, if in fact it is at all, by the interplay of the three ships, the Titanic, the Californian, and the Carpathia. But it was designed to put to that audience that the leadership of the church was being shared by all of them too, and that it was worth doing. And by arguing that we should all be on the Carpathia, as you know, the hero ship that with real risk steamed through those dangerous waters at night, saved the 710 people in the lifeboats, and not on the Californian that was closer, saw the distress flares, did nothing, and saved no one. It was also a call to action. Now, why would I trawl through this personal journey with you today, even very briefly? And the reason is that I wanted to share a program that the board of St. Vincent's has embarked on to reimagine our organisation and Catholic healthcare generally through the prism of our duty as leaders of the church. We devoted much of the spiritual formation of the board's program for the last 18 months to this process of discernment, asking whether our own vision and our deepest hopes and aspirations for our extraordinary ministry reflect our prime purpose to witness Christ's healing presence and the power of the Spirit of God in our contemporary society. We also invited the trustees of Mary Aikenhead Ministries, many of whom I acknowledge in the room today, to join us in this journey, knowing their key role in any decision and the impact it would have on their task as well. And in spite of COVID's best efforts, we have sought to travel together, for which I thank them. Now, you may ask why St. Vincent's put so much emphasis on redefining our mission in terms of church leadership, particularly in the middle of the pandemic when there were many other things on all our minds. And there are two drivers, and the first being what is happening in the church where we share this leadership. And we've had an amount of that discussion in the last 24 hours. There can be no doubt that the church we lead is in crisis, even if the part for which we are directly responsible appears less challenged. The privileged position we in the church have held since early days is under great challenge, particularly through the failures of the current structures, but partly through the collapse of trust of all institutions and the associated secularisation of Western societies. That secularisation is increasingly malignant, strident and well-resourced. And aided by Australia's decline in Christian affiliation over the past 25 years, from 80% to 44%. The Plenary Council is a sign of that crisis and the difficulty of the response, and I'll come back to the Archbishop's comments at the end of these remarks. The relationship between the Church and the state is being renegotiated, and we come to that place in a place of real weakness, in spite of our belief that our Church remains one of the most powerful forces for good in contemporary society. That is the Church context we need to understand as we seek to thrive and grow our role in society and to nurture our particular ministries. If we're tempted to be complacent as the current focus is not on us in health and aged care, think about the limited influence we have had in the institutional conscientious objection discussion around assisted dying, or the limited success we've had in keeping our position relatively steady in the area of public health, where new opportunities rely upon community support. There's no lack of signs that the strong position of the Church, which has defended our role and helped us to grow, is significantly diminished. Or even look at the ministries in places like Ireland, great sadness for us charity friends, and in places like Canada and other places. So if the first basis of this emphasis is the current position of the Church, the second is the growing awareness amongst us that our business models are challenged by the changes in the expectations of the health and aged care systems, and the doubt that even the largest players are well equipped to ensure sustainable growth through these changes. This awareness was heightened for us at St Vincent's by our most recent strategic planning refresh, which I suspect came up with similar conclusions about the changed environment that flowed from the same work going on in all your organisations. In particular, we saw that none of our three businesses, public health, private health and aged care, were at a scale where we could confidently impact on our environment to ensure the sustainability of any of them. None were in difficulty, but none were at scale. And then we factored in the capital demands of remaining at the forefront of each of those activities, maintaining relevance to the communities that we serve, providing some confidence that we could grow through these barriers and at least maintain our relative position. The strategy concluded that we needed change well beyond the reach of our current structures. And there, my friends, sits our hairy friend. At the intersection of a church in crisis and change and a sector facing profound dynamic challenge. Now, the joy of becoming a chair of a CHA member is that you get a sense very early that this concern about scale and structure is a commonly held view. It gets raised with you pretty quickly. So once our strategic thinking confirmed that this was a discussion that our long-term future demanded, we shifted our formation program to ask, through a structured discernment, how would we define the goals that we would seek from any change? We asked Dr. Christian Jacobs Vandergeer and Dr. Maeve Heaney, I think they are both here, I hope they are, from the ACU, and thank you to both of those, they were great companions, to help us through the process that we knew we had to start, but we knew we had to start with the question of whether we were approaching our future and any possible discussions with you, our sector colleagues, as leaders of St Vincent's Health, seeking to ensure that its interests were protected, or as leaders of the Church, with a much broader shared brief. Now, this may seem easy and obvious, although I suspect probably to most of you, you know it isn't, but it isn't. And we've all built-in experience in dealing with structural issues of this kind, and we thought that applying that approach to this task did not seem promising at all. So after collating the expectations of each director for the journey, the next session was around the promise. To whom are we promised? What have we promised? And how do we ensure that we are trustworthy holders of the promise? I thought personally it was a rather strange place to start. But not so. It is in fact a familiar challenge to all of us, of course, who govern activities for others. It certainly is now front and centre for all corporate directors as we grapple with many promises and expectations. But church leadership is indeed more complex. Is our promise to the trustees or the congregation, or the foundress and her charism, or our society, our patients, our residents, our own people? Or is it to all of the above? And can they all be incorporated under our promise to the church as the people of God? Another highlight from our discernment was our session with Archbishop Coleridge, gave us that beautiful mass last night, on the state of the church and what leadership he thought we could provide in such an environment. His challenge was, what can we do to ensure our society sees the church as something more than an old, weary, wounded institution? In setting that challenge, he also endorsed the Vatican II view of the church and our leadership role. The power of a loving Spirit of God alive in our community cannot be achieved by clerical leadership alone. Some responsibility and hope clearly has to sit elsewhere. Later in the year, we had a beautiful session on charism, a specific calling recognised by the church and approved as authentic. We all have them, and they are cherished, and rightly so. For the Sisters of Charity, it is focused on our service to the poor. We all understood the importance of identifying how to nourish these charisms, as we know that any discussion around structure must find its true compass from our spiritual heritage and our charisms. Finally, we looked at the central role of the Spirit as the presence of God in our world today, the manifestation of his love, and what brings Christ's healing presence to reality. Our discernment throws up many complex promises and goals, but none more powerful than witnessing to the presence of the Spirit as a vital pillar supporting what is best in our wonderful Australian society. Now, clearly, before you think I'm getting too carried away, this journey does not replace the promise of achieving and sustaining excellence in health and aged care. That remains, of course, the central and essential base. But it enriches that promise at a second level as our promise to the church as the people of God at this particular cultural moment, and then ultimately to a third level of our promise to our whole community and beyond. It builds on excellence in the task we have been given, and we all understand that we are not effective leaders of anything if we neglect our own ministries. Now, this may seem a rather leisurely timetable for preparing an approach to this question, whether it's a guerrilla or not, and it's true that COVID may have prolonged this effort a little, but we are now ready at St Vincent's to look at different structures and to test them against our responsibility as leaders of the church, trying to see if the power of the Spirit will be released by change, and whether the healing power of Jesus will be more clearly understood and respected by our community if we all carry out these ministries in a different way. If the answer is yes, then the call to action is unavoidable. If no, then all the synergies in the financial model may really not justify the effort. Now, it may seem strange that I argue this is urgent and then say we put aside more than a year to discern the mission definition against which we will judge our alternatives, but I actually think this is classic Catholic discernment. There is a sense of urgency, but we haven't rushed it. But the discernment does have a purpose. It's not theoretical. And it drives how we move forward in two profound ways. Firstly, if we all approach these issues representing our different entities, it will lead us to a fairly conventional merger discussion which, over time, in a rather random way, put like-minded entities together. It will be a process of the kind we're all used to, cutting deals, making compromises, and it's an entirely practical way, I might say, to move forward. But if we approach the question jointly as leaders of the church, then we start from a very different base. We are, in fact, already merged. We always have been, as part of a single, unified church. And if so, most of the separate agendas can be put aside, and those taking part have a single role of discerning and deciding what structure best meets our shared mission, and then, of course, our many other obligations. It's a very different process and could avoid a sense of obligation to fight battles on behalf of structures that, to be honest, no longer exist, or to win battles along the way that will be seen later to be quite pointless. I stress again, however, that coming from the perspective of church leadership does not compete with health services leadership, and no discernment on mission will be complete without considering all the strategic health challenges I listed earlier in the remarks. But the focus is broader and it is different. Secondly, if the task is really one of joint discernment on how to respond vitally to the power of the Spirit, then doing it one by one makes little sense. If we have a single task of deciding what Catholic health and aged care should look like on the basis of its core mission, then that discernment should be better done by us all and together. Now, that does not mean, of course, that any conclusion would commit all of those involved to some action. That's a totally different question. Nor does it assume that such a process would call for any change at all. It may decide that our structures, the product of our remarkable history, are fortunately ideally placed for the next few decades. And I'd have to say, for my part, I would be somewhat relieved if that's the point we reached, as long as we agreed it was a refreshed vision and not the default option. Now, before we committed all our formation resources over a year to this journey, we needed to answer two practical questions, and I'd like to finish my remarks dealing with both of them. Firstly, is there any chance that the conditions that are required for change exist? Is there any prospect that if we called for change, can it happen? And secondly, are we confident that a different structure might give us the opportunity to do anything inspirational and new with our mission that might justify the effort? So on the first question, whether significant change is contemplated, whenever significant change is contemplated, the immediate and most powerful barrier is always, as you know, this seems just too hard. But the Church has refined this pessimism to an exquisite degree. So we need to face it openly and ask whether we have any chance to make significant change to our structure if we decided that our mission and our businesses would benefit profoundly. Can we hope to put aside the decades of competition, rivalry amongst services, and even charisms, and come to the process as equal players with a common purpose? Can we leave our loyalties at the door and work as leaders of a single church? Now, my sense is that the answer until a few years ago might be courageous in the Sir Humphrey sense. With all the history of different religious orders who founded our ministries, too strong to share the space with the general promise to Christ as the heart of the church as a whole. But the balance has changed, and these ministries are now given to us to re-envisage their futures and their roles. If there are barriers which cannot be overcome, they will be found here, in this room. And for my part, I have not met one leader since getting involved with CHA who I would not feel privileged to walk with on such a journey. As Sister Claire and her fellow sisters have made clear, we are given this responsibility not to preserve the ministries, but to nurture and to nourish, and if called on by the Spirit, to reinterpret. Another way of posing this question is to ask, why start now? Surely it would be better to wait for a real crisis so that the need for action would be more obvious, but that would be the only advantage. Discerning a path to deliver our mission most powerfully can best be done when the parties have real options coming from strength and mutual respect. And I personally wonder whether now might be the last opportunity to have such a discernment. Now, the second question is is there any evidence that there are sunlit uplands worthy of the effort? How confident are we that doing things differently might impact upon how well we lead the church? Well, of course, the answer to that question lies in the discernment that I'm suggesting we should have. But you can identify the importance of scale. Our sector has revenues of over $8 billion, 27% market share of private hospitals, 62 hospitals across all states, 80,000 workers, 12,000 beds. And if you include aged care providers, then we'd be the largest in the country in both residential, home-based care, annual procurement spend of $1 billion. So it's got scale, got lots and lots of scale. Now, scale has financial benefits, and that would be identified, I have no doubt, in any review by our managements as part of this overall discernment. But the focus of these remarks is more on how it can strengthen the mission that we have defined above and beyond those financial benefits. So here are some of the areas which we could see that strength applied could actually impact on. Advocacy for systemic change to the health system to ensure it can use emerging technologies to provide a seamless patient-centred experience. Ensuring that the poor and marginalised are at the centre of that reform, including building from the determinants of health. National leadership of ESG in healthcare, responding to the call of the Dato Si. National leadership in combating modern slavery, giving a solid base to the great start that ACAN has made in this respect. National leader in reconciliation, caring for and employing our Indigenous community. National leadership in palliative care. Global best practice in technology integration across all areas of care, excellence in research and rapid application. Leverage of other church entities, especially in education, to ensure the best future workforce. I mean, the list has a Mikado feel, doesn't it? It is as long as you want to make it, and nothing will be missed. But from a starting point of generating adequate funds to survive at the very low end, through to witnessing powerfully to the value of faith-based community services at the other end. Our aim would be to be recognised beacon for the church's impact on society and move the perception of the community where CHA's latest research indicated that only about 30% of the population knew the church was even involved in public health. Now, this analysis seeks, and I stress, to show only one thing, that a change in structure will profoundly change capability. But I stress that different does not mean better, and this is where the discernment from this point should lie. I could give a glowing report on how a new structure would emerge as a powerful new voice of the church and the healing power of Jesus, meeting the aspirations of both the archbishops, actually. But equally, I could denounce it as a cumbersome and bureaucratic nightmare that has squeezed the spark out of the original charisms of the component parts. Both versions are quite possible, particularly if we approach the issue from the wrong perspective. But prayerful discernment, listening to the Spirit, should, I think, lead us to the better path. And I'd have to say, when I heard Archbishop Costello, as you would probably imagine yesterday, talking about it, I thought, wow, that seemed to me that is exactly what he's saying. You know, listening together, group of disciples, the synodal option with leading to evangelisation, and read the sign of the times in light of the Gospels. I mean, every single bit of that I sat there thinking, this is a wonderful call, and a call that I think is relevant to what we're talking about. So, let me conclude by going back to my opening remarks. We have all found ourselves as leaders of the church during an extraordinary time for the church and for our ministries. Discerning how we can all play the most powerful role requires wisdom and courage, and I suspect some persistence. It will also require balance, to be open to the Spirit, but also to be able to identify early the outcomes, perhaps the charisms or the brands, that must be defended and preserved. My purpose today is to give you an insight into our program and to provide transparency as to what we will do next. But of course, it is much more than that. It is an invitation to join us and help shape the next part of the journey together, with the only conditions that we all do it as leaders of a single church, and that we focused first on what will ensure our witness to the power of the Spirit and the healing power of Jesus is the defining charism of these future ministries. Thank you.
So thank you, Paul. Well, that's woken us all up, hasn't it? Look, that was a really thought-provoking discussion. And I personally think, the time is nigh. We are leaders of the church, and we are also leaders within our ministries. Paul talked about opening the door to the gorilla, which I think you've absolutely achieved this morning. But fundamentally, you also asked us about how do we fulfil our promise. And I'd like to welcome Virginia Burke, who is a fellow board member on CHA, but also the Chair for Mercy Health, for some comments.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jenny. Yes, well, Paul certainly let the gorilla loose in the room, I think, and I do thank you for that, Paul. I'm very grateful for your presentation and for really naming our collective gorilla file. I too was a young articled clerk, very keen, very diligent, but I wasn't as clever as you, Paul, and I opened quite a few gorilla files and paid the price, so yeah, thanks for bringing all of that back. But Paul, I do thank you for situating our particular gorilla in such a very considered and measured way. Our current reality, really, this intersection between a church in crisis, struggling with credibility and really legitimacy certainly in the public arena, and also the current extreme pressure on all of our health and aged care and community care sectors. And I think it's fair to say that all of us would recognise that, those who sit around board tables, executive tables, trustee tables, all of us know that is our reality. And I think all of that does point to the growing need that Paul identified to really understand and accept our role as lay leaders. I certainly had experience of that in the plenary council recently, and I think all of us, we have both a right through baptism and a responsibility to undertake this work, even if we perhaps didn't fully realise it. And I think Paul shared with us his experience of sort of coming to that realisation. So thank you for that. And thank you too, Paul, for sharing the discernment process that St Vincent's have undergone along those lines. I also am grateful for the invitation, as I heard it, to consider a joint process of discernment about the future of all of our ministries, large and small, and really about the possibilities that we might explore as a group. That is the invitation that I heard. And I think it's important that we don't leap to solution or outcome because I think we are in danger of being overwhelmed by complexity. I think sometimes complexity has a paralysing effect. So I think it's important that we really bring a particular disposition to the task of discernment. And I think it's a disposition of generosity where we don't look to simply reaping the benefits from opportunities that may arise. The disposition is one, I think, where all ministries can prosper, both small and large, and that we don't end up with just large ministries that lose our reach, our collective impact. It's also, I think, a disposition of being open to possibility. And I know that we all have brands that are valuable and charisms that are very precious to us. But our role as leaders is not simply to defend those at all costs. Really, I think it's incumbent on all of us to really test our structures and our cultures, our deeply held ways of being, and really testing them against our responsibilities as leaders of the church at this time. And I think that means, yes, an openness to possibility is what we are called to do. Because I think the task ahead of us is one of reimagination. Really, what is it that we could be collectively? And many of you, I think, would have heard Sister Joan Chichester in her recent tour of Australia, and she was fond of opening, I think, many of her presentations with this, the words of Teilhard de Chardin. And she would say emphatically that as church leaders, the only task worthy of our efforts is to construct the future. And I think that is something that I needed to hear, that we are not just guarding the past or looking to the past or just worrying incessantly. We are constructing the future. And I think that is what Paul's invitation to us today is. And I think if we are to do that, if we are all to sit around the table of our reflection, of Mark's reflection this morning, it is a call to unity in some ways, which is very challenging, I think, for us. It's also a call for trust and to build on the strong relationships that we know we already have. And I think the last few days has reflected that back to me, that how strong the relationships are, how many of us are interconnected, how many of us have served in multiple ministries across charisms. I consider myself an amalgam of many charisms, and I think many of you would as well. I think that gives us the base of trust to really build on constructing the future. We don't know exactly what it is, but the task is surely not beyond us. So I thank you again, Paul, both for the challenge and for the invitation, and I think it was issued in a most gracious way to all of us. I hope that for the sake of all of those who are not at the table, the dispossessed, the marginalised, the people who don't even know there is a table, I hope that we can build that table and really draw in all of those people who we serve. So I hope for the sake of all those people we can grasp the challenge and the invitation. Thank you.